Mark Bittman for Edible Education 101, and I'm here with my friend Raj Patel, who is a research professor at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas in Austin, and a former organizer of Edible Education 101. Hi, Raj.
Mark, hello.
We'll talk about a bunch of things, so why don't we start with what are people doing right around the world that we in the United States who concentrate on food and food policy can learn from?
Well, one of the things in the discussion today is about the anxiety that everyone has about what to eat. I mean, God knows, we've all written op-eds and maybe even the odd book instructing people on what it is that they ought to be eating and not to be eating. Part of that is that we've, for centuries, have been actually concerned about what it is that we should be eating and not eating. There's the industry of figuring out what nutritionists say has been going on for 400 years.
What were the early discussions like?
As we'll find out in today's lecture, I mean, they were about whether one should eat rich food or poor food, or whether one should eat milk or not. Whether one should be concerned about food coming from abroad.
Sounds very familiar.
Yeah, it is. I mean, there was a concern about eating potatoes, these strange food from Peru, that looks very much like the discussion around quinoa. I mean, quinoa, also a strange food from Peru. Most of us hadn't eaten it 10 years ago, and now we all have. Right. So that idea is something that's quite old. But one of the things that is happening around the world that people are getting right is the observation that we are surrounded by noise about what it is we should be. There's way too much nutritional information in the world today. If you Google, what should I eat? Is it okay to eat this? What's the most healthy food? Google will spew millions of pages back at you. You will never get through those pages. So one answer is actually to turn down the level of information and misinformation by reducing the level of advertising. Advertising is meant to be this fantastic thing where the rational consumer goes around and finds good information and then makes a rational choice on the basis of that information. That's the economic theory of what advertising is. It's just information out there in the world. But we know that that's not really how the world works. Advertising, particularly when it's directed at children, isn't about informing rational consumers, because we agree that children are not rational. That's why we don't let them vote or give them guns, except in Texas. But one of the things that is good is increasing moves to ban advertising to children, because that reduces the nutritional noise and creates a bit of space where you can get decent nutritional education going.
So where are we seeing that most effectively?
Well, Brazil has some of the most sweeping legislation. Unfortunately, it's caught up in legal disputes at the moment. But what they want to do is ban the advertising of everything to children. But you're seeing, interestingly,
toys, clothing, everything.
Because why are children the people who get to make decisions about things? I mean, again, the logic here is if you're banning advertising of food to children, the same argument applies to absolutely everything else. Children are not rational, they're not any more rational about their toys than they are about their clothing, than they are about
but some things are more harmful than others. Anyway, this is not an argument we need to have.
But I think the economic theory requires a rational being, and children aren't that. And I think what's interesting is the extent to which adults are or aren't rational. I mean, we see a lot of economic theory that suggests that, in fact, adult human beings, aren't terribly rational either. That's why I like Mayor Bloomberg's initiative. You lived in New York when that happened. Well, I mean, what did you think of that when that went down?
The big gulp theory?
The big gulp theory.
Well, I actually thought they were grasping at straws, and that, for those who don't know, the mayor of New York, Mayor Bloomberg, did come close to passing a soda tax, but it was disallowed by the state, if my recollection is correct.
And then there was also the cup initiative.
Right. Then they fell back. The fallback position was outlawing or banning sodas that were more than 16 ounces.
Right.
This was actually passed unanimously by the Board of Health and then overturned by a court. The reason I thought that the big gulp ban, as it was called, was grasping at straws is because since then, I think 2 or perhaps even 3 better ideas have come along. So I think soda taxes is a better idea than a big gulp ban. I think carding that is saying sodas can't be sold to young children under, say, 16 without a parent present is a good idea. I think warning labels is a really good idea.
Yeah.
And I think banning advertising is a really good idea.
Right.
All of those, I think, are better than the big gulp idea. But what I say, because many people, the whole nanny statism thing, blah, blah, many people don't like these ideas. And I say, pick one. I don't even care which one. Let's enact it and let's see what happens. So in Mexico, we have a real soda tax, national.
Right.
And it's worked.
Yes. I mean, and that's happened, and it's driven down soda consumption in the country where people drink more soda than they do milk. But one of the reasons to drink soda is because you don't
more
trust
soda than anyone else in the world,
anyone,
by
exactly,
the way.
Yeah. But one of the reasons to do that is because the water is dodgy, and one of the, what I'm worried about is that the rationale for passing the soda tax in Mexico was to be able to make water available for poor rural communities. I worry that the government is sitting on the money and not spending it, and that
Or spending it on something else.
Or spending on something else, exactly. And that may undo the political legitimacy of the soda tax. Now, there are obvious public health benefits already from reduced soda consumption, but it was passed with a promise about moving towards more water for poor communities. And I think that if you don't have that basis, you end up with some with some unsound legislation, and people will be able to say, well, Mexico promised this, but they didn't deliver, and so when you, Berkeley, promised to have education programs for kids, but with a soda tax, we know that we don't trust you either because you're the government. And I think that does a little bit of, it undoes some of the justification. But I disagree with you about the big gulp thing, because again, we think about smoking. I mean, obviously everyone has the analogy with smoking. There are lots of things that need to happen at the same time in order to be able to combat a public health menace as pervasive as smoking. So it's not just about banning advertising, it's about putting taxes. It's, in Australia, they've got plain packaging laws now where, despite Philip Morris's attempt to fight back, in Australia they have just plain packages with sans serif lettering of saying Marlboro or whatever variety of cigarettes they are.
No marketing even on the package.
Exactly. Right. And there are a range of things that happen in tandem to be able to move us towards a healthier outcome. And I do think that soda, limiting the amount of soda that you can get to a cup the size of 16 ounces is a good move, because some researchers at Cornell recently produced a paper that showed that if you have bigger sizes, people will naturally, because we are irrational, drift towards those larger sizes. In other words, and I think one of the researchers put it like this, that people are often dumber than a paper cup. And that's, what can you do? We're human beings who think that we're making free choices, but we've got 5 different things, we go for the second biggest. That's just what we do. Right. So why make the biggest thing something that's the size of your head? Why not make it just 16 ounces? Then people get 16 ounces. If you want to drink 64 ounces, carry the 4 cups. You'll be fine.
Well, I'm fine with that. I was sort of ranking what I felt, what I'm guessing would be most effective. By saying, there's a parallel with cigarettes, which to my knowledge has never been tried, which might be to say no more carton sales of cigarettes. You want to buy cigarettes, you buy individual packs.
Right.
No discounts, no carton sales. You could do that.
Yeah.
You could do it by selling individual cigarettes, which of course
does
happen.
It does, right,
but that'll disincentivize you, $1 per cigarette.
Right.
What other things are other countries doing that are interesting?
I like Brazil's approach to tying the country and the city together. One of the ways that we are baffled in the modern food system is we have no idea where our food comes from. And although in the Edible Education series we like to sort of sort of encourage those connections at the undergraduate level, school meals are an important place where children can learn about where their food comes from. Brazil has now a purchasing program where I believe between 20 and 30% of food sold in schools comes from local farmers. And there's a premium paid to farmers who farm agroecologically. So because it costs more to farm well as opposed to with pesticides,
right.
You pay the farmers for that labor and for that care of the soil, and they get 30% more money for growing food that way. And it ends up being a fantastic way not only of educating kids, but also it becomes a sort of moment of celebration when the farmers come in and all the kids help unload stuff, and they're engaged in their food and the food system, sponsored by the government in a way that encourages the knitting together of the city and the countryside. And I think that's one of the, as we move to a world that is more urban than rural, the loss of that link to the countryside, to where our food comes from, to the soil where that happens, to the labor that is embodied in that food, I think is a grave one. And to see countries really taking that and going the other way, I think is very encouraging.
We've talked about Mexico, we've talked about Brazil, and this is not a rhetorical question. Are there any other countries doing interesting things that we might want to know about?
Well, I mean, Cuba has fantastic agroecological policies, even though at the same time it's got horrible industrial policies. But Cuban peasants are really at the forefront of imagining what a sustainable agricultural policy might look like, one that's zero carbon and that can survive climate change much better than traditional monoculture. But it's not just countries we should be looking at. Nations are important too. And for students to understand this, it's very important that the nation and the state are not the same thing. In the United States, we have one government. We have 50 states, but we have hundreds of nations. Many of those nations are First Nations, indigenous people, and those are different nations that exist within the borders of the state. Now, I point that out because in Peru, there's a really exciting indigenous people's group that's in a place called the Potato Park, and they've taken their indigenous knowledge and they've taken it back from the state and put it back into the nation of Quechua speakers, made it an indigenous property right. And so one of the reasons I throw that out as an example to say, hey, you know what, indigenous people can get their property back from the governments that stole it, is to help us imagine ways of doing government that aren't just about the nation state. We think about the nation state and the United Nations and think that that's the only way we can govern, and it isn't. We can look at nations governing themselves, we can look at cities governing themselves. The Los Angeles Unified School District has some of the best purchasing policy in the United States, where they really are trying to make sure that labor and the environment are respected as food gets into the bellies of school children in LA. So one of the nice things about the world, particularly when it comes to food, is that you don't have to look just at government, at national governments. You can look at groups that secede from national governments. You can look at city-states, so you can look at cities, for example. And that's a very exciting series of interventions as well.
Yeah, that's true. We talk about that a lot. We talk about the importance of working locally and acting locally, because it's so difficult to have an effect on federal governments.
Right.
I mean, especially in food policy.
It's true, and of course that can often feel like a retreat, can't it? Right? It's like, well, screw the federal government. There's no way. Pepsi has the government in their hand, so let's do what we can at the local level. But it can also be that what you do at the local level can far exceed what can be done at the federal level, even in your wildest dreams. And that's kind of the joy of thinking about things that happen at a local level that couldn't possibly be mandated by the federal government, and you wouldn't want it to be anyway.
So any other food policy things that are happening around North America, around the world, that are happening on a local level that are especially interesting?
I mean, the things coming out of food policy councils food policy councils, I love the idea, and then when one looks at how they function, often they're a conduit for particular kinds of interest. But that doesn't mean that food policy councils are bad. It just means that we need to be looking at those food policy councils and dreaming them bigger. But the Toronto Food Policy Council has been doing stuff around farmers markets, when to imagine a farmers market in an urban area was to be talking crazy talk, right. Because we had supermarkets. Why would you want a farmer's market? They're doing a lot of rooftop gardening stuff in Toronto that I think is very interesting. They're also, particularly while we think of ourselves in a time of refugees and of clashing cultures, there are really exciting ordinances and ideas in Canada being driven by community food banks that are about allowing immigrant communities access to land and access to spaces to be able to grow food that's familiar to them. Right. And I think that's also very exciting.
Yeah.
But I mean, I come from Texas, where Syrians are not welcome. So I mean, for whatever crazy politics that speaks, it's not. I wish it were happening more, certainly in my part of the world. But I do get excited by those ideas, because when Carlo was here, I wonder whether he was speaking about some of the slow food ideas around immigration. I was really inspired by some of their stuff, right? Because what they're saying is that they were taking the immigration idea very seriously. I mean, you have no idea how bad it is in Europe right now. I mean, there are swimming pools in Germany that don't allow refugees in. I mean, it's, you know, there are people being made to wear armbands. I mean, that got struck down pretty quickly, but still, it's horrific. And what I loved about what Slow Food was saying was, you know, we need to think about how gastronomy changes, how cultures change, how food cultures and you know, how food cultures can expand with new traditions being brought in. You know, Italy's food culture, you know, is itself the product of theft from around the world. I mean, noodles come from Asia, and the tomato comes from the New World. You know, your spaghetti with tomato sauce is nothing but immigration, and Slow Food really got that. And I think that some of the policy that's happening around immigration and food is really exciting, because it offers a moment where we can think about cultures exchanging. It's the good kind of globalization, of sort of cross-fertilization rather than of competition and being at each other's throats. So I like that kind of gastronomic municipality as well.
That's great. You know, we started talking about the complexities that confront all of us and have for so long about nutrition. And yet, the simplest messages, you know, Michael's eat food, not too much, mostly plants, are the truest in a way, because we know for everything we learn about nutrition, we discard a bunch of old ideas, and everybody is completely skeptical of new ones, because we've seen how many truths have been discarded.
Yeah.
But the very simple ones, eat real food, or, you know, depend on whole foods, depend on plants, on animal products, decently raised, so on, avoid hyper-processed stuff.
Yep.
How do we get that message across in a way that's meaningful?
Well, I think that's why turning down the noise is important, because otherwise eat food, mostly plants and not too much, becomes just another thing like, you know, make sure that you have omega-3s, or, you know, it sits at the same level of nutritional advice where someone's giving you, saying, look, do these 3 things, and someone else is saying, make sure that this is in your food, and someone else is saying, well, acai berries are the superfood, and all of a sudden you have a bunch of competing experts. And what I quite like to do is turn down the level of expertise. And what I'm arguing, I guess, in tonight's talk is that expertise is itself produced at the same time as the confused consumer. These things happen at the same time. In Britain, it's certainly a very middle-class consumer, a new bourgeois consumer that emerges in the 1600s. But it's a real thing to be a confused consumer, and to have nutritional experts ministering to your confusion. There's a sort of symbiosis of confusion and expert. And I would like to turn down the noise so that the confusion gets to be a little less. And that means reducing, you know, things like advertising, so that you're not bamboozled by you know, sort of different conflicting ideas. Because this confusion is part of the state of being in the modern world. I have a very long talk tonight, and I had to lose a slide. One of the slides I had to lose was advice from the Good Housekeeping magazine from the 1950s about the quality of toilet paper that we need to be wiping our asses with. In the 1950s, they thought that if toilet paper was not absorbent, that would be much better for you. And so basically you're wiping your butt with grease-proof paper. And I'm young enough, or old enough, I suppose, to remember a time where, in fact, the toilet paper in our schools was like wax-coated toilet paper. It sounds absurd, but there was medical opinion that said that this was the right thing to do. And I'm baffled by why this would be a thing. But people will look back at our time and look at our nutritional debates and be equally baffled about why it is, you know, it's as absurd now for us to be talking about this nutrient or that nutrient missing in our food, or you know, saturated fats and polyunsaturated fats. I mean, in the kind of discourse that we're talking about them, as it is to talk about wax-proof, you know, sort of waxed toilet paper. But that's the kind of milieu in which we find ourselves, where advice is being offered by health professionals left, right, and center. You know, doctors advised smoking Camels, for example, in the 50s. You know, these kinds of absurdity are made possible by a level of just noise and information, misinformation about food that I think needs to be turned down.
Yeah, I mean, the question is really, how do you get how do you get to the future? Because in the future, we're going to be smacking ourselves on top of our heads and saying, how did we let kids drink that much soda without trying to do something about it?
Well, but we know the answer now. I mean, that's the tragedy of it. We know that the reason we let kids do it is because these companies have so much power that we are not organized enough to be able to stop them. And I think that's the heartbreaking part of it, right? It's not that we'll be slapping ourselves on the head, because we know now what the problem is, and we know who it is that's making money off it, and how difficult it is for us to undo their power. But I think the ongoing struggle is to be able to organize better, to be able to end the power of large food corporations in the food system.
I agree. I do the slapping on the head thing because I sort of think about what happens at the end of wars when there's a treaty and some people get killed anyway after the treaty because the word wasn't out yet.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And when the word is out about, when we finally say we have to limit the marketing of junk to children, for example, it will be 10 years or 20 years or 50 years after what you're saying is true, and a lot of people will have become ill and died in that period of time, and those diseases could have been prevented. It was one thing in the 30s when it wasn't known that tobacco was harmful. It was one thing in the 60s when it wasn't known that sugar was harmful, but those things are known, so it becomes doubly tragic.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
It's like lead paint. Okay, well, you didn't know, but once you know, there's no excuse. And that's so sad. It's really killer. Every year or two, it seems, we learn that some nutritional information that we were sure about in the recent past is wrong, or likely to be wrong. What are we seeing? What shibboleths, is that the word? Are we seeing fall now? What icons are we seeing fall now?
Often a lot of nutritional information is given to us so that we can internalize it and behave as nutritional experts tell us. And one of the ways that we then work with that information is to see do we obsessively weigh ourselves? It turns out a lot of American consumers don't. But we're meant to be these sort of self-disciplined subjects, these kind of Foucault robots who are obsessively monitoring our bodies to make sure that we're behaving properly. And that making sure that our weight is right for our height, for example, and that's an idea of body mass index that is starting to turn. In part because body mass index is one of these ideas that relates weight and height together in a way that is meant to give important predictive information. And it turns out that many of the studies were done just using white college kids, and the body mass index is not a reliable guide globally for certain kinds of outcome. But much more importantly, the obsession with body mass index ends up being reflected in society in really important ways. I mean, there's a lot, for example, of fat shaming. And if we're thinking about the future, I think part of what we have to be thinking about is becoming okay with different shaped bodies. One of the ways in which we're policed by advertising is to imagine ourselves in the most perfect body ever. Most of us don't have that. And most of us never will.
Right.
It's not a fair world to hold up these images, particularly for girls, but for men as well, of a certain kind of body shape, a certain kind of race. I mean, obviously, sort of white supremacy is an important part of the marketing of food, and I think that's also an important. We need to be confronting that, and it's really interesting that we have these sort of classed and raced ideas of food, but body shape and body size matters too. So, for example, we know in the United States that being poor is correlated with being overweight. But there's a really interesting battle over causation. What are the causal links between poverty and being overweight? Well, actually, there's a very easy causal link that you can make that goes the other way. Overweight people are much less likely to get jobs compared to people who are more slender. So that's one way in which being overweight causes you to be poor. Now, that's nothing to do with some inherent property of being overweight that leads to poverty. It's just society discriminates against people who are overweight. It discriminates against fat people.
Nutrition. That's interesting.
So,
I hadn't thought of that.
So that idea of the way that we perceive and read each other's bodies, we get from society, we get from marketing, we get from the various images that we see on TV and around us. And I think that again, if we think about moving to the future, we need to be okay, and we need to learn to love and respect our own bodies and the bodies of other people, in any shape. And you can be healthy pretty much at any way. I mean, there are weights at which the dangers are very clear. But the idea of the obsessively toned, trimmed, perfect body that we all have to inhabit is one of these things also that's been marketed to us. And I'll talk about that tonight.
I think the thing I read about body mass index in the last couple of days was that 40% of overweight people have no markers of unhealthiness other than a high body mass index, and 20% of obese people, same thing. So that's a lot of people who don't really have problems, who are being either shamed, pathologized, guilt-tripped. Yeah. So how does that play out? Mostly that feels like an American discussion, but there's an international component too, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, for example, in South Asia, for instance, it's possible for men who look like me to have a fairly normal body mass index, but to be afflicted by diabetes. It's just, not all bodies are built the same way as the parameters, the bodies around which the parameters of body mass index were created. So you look just like I do and have type 2 diabetes, and I am technically not overweight, but I'm certainly a very high risk for diabetes. And again, that's one of the dangers here, is that there's a sort of universalized idea that I know how to read your body, and I can say, well, that guy's probably overweight, or he could stand to lose a few pounds. Where does that come from, and what is it that gives you the ability, the capacity, the right to say that? In what name? And usually it's under the banner of nutrition, of health, of well-being, of consideration for you, my fellow man or woman, who could stand to lose a few pounds. But that's something. Where does that come from?
Right.
And again, I mean, that's an international discussion. It's a domestic discussion, but it's something also that reaches into the heart of us. And I think that's maybe the hardest part of the international food system to understand. Is that one of the most pernicious, the most deeply rooted, the most intractable products of the modern food system is us.
Well, thanks, Raj. I've been talking with Raj Patel, and I'm Mark Bittman.